Good morning. It is Friday, June the 21st, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. And it looks as though the retaliation against Iran for the downing of one of our drones is a no-go. Apparently the president was going to initiate a strike yesterday and then changed his mind at the last minute. But that's an issue I'm going to cover in a few minutes. This is my podcast called The Drill, and it's about the difference between being a true conservative and being a reactionary. It's about what true conservatism is, why it matters. And my podcast is made possible by Spreaker.com. It can be heard on iTunes and Spotify, among others. My email address is storytimes@hotmail.com. I am on Twitter @RonaldHardgrove and on Facebook @The Drill. I started my socio-political odyssey as a conservative Republican. I knew that I was a conservative Republican because of where I stood on the issues. When I engaged a liberal in debate, though, I felt as though I was losing the argument. But I knew I was right. So if I know that I'm right, but I feel like I'm losing the argument, then I know something is wrong. And so it was then that I decided to investigate the liberal-conservative dynamic, and after considerable study, I figured out that in debates, I was being tricked. I not only figured out the fact that I was being tricked, but how it was being done. In the process of figuring these things out, I've discovered the following. Being a true conservative is knowing that the essence of any argument is change. And that where you stand on change is where you stand politically. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is realistic and conservative. And if it ain't broke, break it is idealistic and socialist. My position on the issues is irrelevant. Political identity is based on philosophical reality. What is the status quo? Individuality. True conservatives know that the individual is primary, and liberals/socialists subordinate the individual to the group. However, the rights enumerated in the Constitution are individual rights, not human rights, not white rights, not men's rights, not straight rights. The true conservative thinks as an individual for and about individuals. By conceding the concept we, reactionaries allow themselves to be trapped into groupthink, inadvertently promoting the very thing they claim to despise, a bloated, overreaching bureaucracy. As a result, the left appears to win again and again. A word about the left. In reality, they have no authority, no power. They can't win. The only reason that they appear to win is that reactionaries give them their victories. Reactionaries, especially talk show hosts, aid and abet the left. The biggest mistake that so-called conservative talk show hosts make is failing to make distinctions, judgmental distinctions between Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal, capitalist and socialist. Republican, conservative, capitalist is better. As a matter of fact, it's best. Conservatives need to remind the public of the superiority of their beliefs every opportunity that they get. The second biggest mistake is that so-called conservative talk show hosts make is being reactionary. Being reactionary is an anti-conceptual mentality that involves reacting to arbitrary claims and aping the left. Arbitrary claims are those claims that lack evidence or proof. Aping the left means copying their communication style, which means making predictions and using anti-concepts. Making predictions deprives conservatives of values by substituting forecasting for moralizing. Moralizing involves judgment. Judgment is used to decide ultimately what is real and what is imaginary. We use judgment instead of prediction because we need to answer the question, what should I do? Not what is going to happen. Using anti-concepts aids the left in obliterating legitimate concepts such as property and conflict of interest. The third biggest mistake pundits make is slavish devotion, or is confusing traditionalism with conservatism. Traditionalism demands a slavish devotion to the status quo. Traditionalism is a mistake because it is as idealistic as socialism. Socialist tells himself, if only we could get rid of the status quo, we'd be all set. The traditionalist tells himself, if only we could get rid of change, we'd be all set. The conservative asks himself, should we change? If it is true that flattery is the sincerest form, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then the right-wing pundits do more to honor the left than to defeat it. And that's the introduction to my podcast, give you kind of an idea of what it's all about here. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading the concept of the day from the Ayn Rand lexicon. Thank you very much. The concept of the day from the Ayn Rand lexicon is gold standard. Gold and economic freedom are inseparable. The gold standard is an instrument of laissez-faire, and each implies and requires the other. What medium of exchange will be acceptable to all participants in an economy is not determined arbitrarily. Where store of value considerations are important, as they are in richer, more civilized societies, the medium of exchange must be a durable commodity, usually a metal. A metal is generally chosen because it is homogeneous and divisible. Every unit is the same as every other, and it can be blended or formed in any quantity. Precious jewels, for example, are neither homogeneous nor divisible. More important, the commodity chosen as a medium must be a luxury. Human desires for luxuries are unlimited, and therefore luxury goods are always in demand and will always be acceptable. The term luxury good implies scarcity and high unit value. Having a high unit value, such good is easily portable. For instance, an ounce of gold is worth a half ton of pig iron. Under the gold standard, a free banking system stands as the protector of an economy's stability and balanced growth. In the absence of the gold standard, there's no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There's no safe store of value. If there were, the government would have to make its holdings illegal, as was done in the case of gold. The financial policy of the welfare state requires there be no way for the owners of wealth to protect themselves. This is the shabby secret of the welfare statists' tirades against gold. Deficit spending is simply a scheme for the hidden confiscation of wealth. Gold stands in the way of this insidious process. It stands as a protector of property rights. If one grasps this, one has no difficulty in understanding the statists' antagonism toward the gold standards. And that was actually Alan Greenspan wrote that in Gold and Economic Freedom. So a couple of comments on this. Let's see. About the laissez-faire. Laissez-faire being the term laissez-faire came when in a time in France in the 1800s, when again there was France was becoming more and more of a welfare state, and there's lots of politicians and bureaucrats that were trying to run the economy, so to speak. And so they went to businessmen, some of these bureaucrats, and asked them, what is it we can do for you? And the businessmen replied, nous laissez-faire, which means leave us alone. So that's where laissez-faire comes from. Let's see. The absence of a gold standard, the banking system protection. The other thing I want to say about having a gold standard is that if you have a gold standard, the economy has a tendency to, or your money has a tendency to gain in value, because we're dealing with something of it's a limited commodity, gold or silver. So the value of gold has a tendency to go up, and therefore your buying power has a tendency to go up. And so you don't need to put your money in a bank and draw interest, or put your money in a 401k and try to get dividends or high returns on stocks and bonds to stay ahead of inflation, because the economy has a tendency to be deflationary. Prices have a tendency to go down, but also so do wages. Let's see. The shabby secrets of office deficit spending, hidden confiscation. That's about it for that one. So that was the gold standard. And the other thing with the reason that we're even on a Keynesian and a dollar-based or paper-based economy was because this was supposed to allow the government to provide a situation where everybody would be able to, there would be ever-increasing prosperity. We would get rid of what used to be referred to as boom and bust cycles, where the economy's going great gangbusters, and then all of a sudden we're in a depression. And so there's those thinkers that figured we could get rid of that. And if we put the government in charge of the economy, we'd straighten out the economy, it would grow, and everybody would prosper without having to worry about being in a recession or a depression. It hasn't worked. It just hasn't worked. We've had recession after recession after recession. The last one was in 2008, and it was quite a doozy. So I will be back in a minute. Thank you very much, and welcome back. I want to talk about Hugh Hewitt and Glenn Beck. They were talking about apparently what happened yesterday after the Iranians shot down a drone is that the Trump administration decided to retaliate. Then at the last minute, about 10 minutes before this retaliation was set to occur, the president called it off, apparently because he was informed by a general that if he continued with it, that approximately 150 people would die. And he decided that that's not equitable or balanced, that the destruction of a drone, an unmanned drone, is not worth 150 lives. So I called it off. So we're kind of in a wait-and-see mode as to whether or not the United States is going to retaliate or not. And there was a lot of talk this morning. Bill O'Reilly got into it because he's a guest on Glenn Beck's show, and then the head of the Hillsdale College, who was a guest on Hugh Hewitt's show, and there was just lots and lots of talk about this, whether he should have done it, shouldn't have done it, what he should do now, and all that. The problem that all of these people are missing, the main big thing that they're all missing here, is that the reason we're in this jam and in this position that we're in right now is because we lack a foreign policy. See, we should not have been in a position where we were surprised by what Iran did. What Iran did, shooting down that drone, should have come to no surprise to anybody who knows what Iran is about and knows the state of Iranian-American relations. Okay, it's predictable that they would do such a thing. They've done these kinds of things in the past. Apparently, just recently, they were blowing up oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. So this should not have come to surprise, but apparently it did, because the president had to stop and think about, gee, what am I going to do now? And all of this is because we don't have a foreign policy. And that's the thing, and we haven't had a foreign policy. It's not just Donald Trump, but we haven't had a foreign policy going back to maybe Reagan, maybe even before that. Maybe we're going back to John F. Kennedy or perhaps Dwight D. Eisenhower. We haven't had one for decades. And the reason we don't have a foreign policy is because of the left's influence in our culture and their ability to intimidate people, specifically with regard to knowledge of reality. That the only way you can have a foreign policy is if you can be certain about things, about what's real and what isn't. The left has convinced us basically that we cannot be certain, so therefore we cannot create policies. That what we have to do is get up every morning, see what happens, and then react to it. But fortunately for all of us, the left is wrong. We can, reality exists, objective reality exists, we can know what it is, and on that basis, we can create a foreign policy so that knowing what it is that Iran is about, knowing what it is that kinds of things that they're willing to do, we can create a policy around that and say if any country destroys any type of military asset that we have, manned, unmanned, or otherwise, then this is the way we intend to respond. Okay, and that's what should be going on. We should not have a situation where the President of the United States, every time something happens, has to stop and think, okay, what do I do now? We had a situation in, I believe it was in the Philippines, where the United States Navy had to take some evasive actions to avoid colliding with a Russian military vessel. And again, so now we're caught in what do we do about this? And we've had other situations with aircraft, Russian aircraft, that are trying to get into United States airspace and whatnot. The Russians are being very, very provocative. And again, if we had a foreign policy, we could deal with these situations. Number one thing in foreign policy-wise, when we look at reality, what is the reality of the world today geopolitically? That the United States of America is the only the only superpower on the planet. We should act that way. We should run things. We should act like a superpower. My motto would be, you mess with the bull, you get the horn. If you want to try and play games of chicken out on the high seas, you might end up taking a missile or two in the side of your vessel. If the Iranians are going to, but I would delegate all that. If I was president, I would delegate all that down. Basically, I would tell the commanders of the ships, whoever it is that's running the drones, that it's up to your call to make. Okay, how to respond, but I would give them permission to use to fire on these vessels and destroy them if necessary, and to do the same thing with regards to the drones. Have the Air Force, assuming that this was an Air Force asset, go ahead and prepare on their own some type of retaliatory strike. And then I don't have to, if I'm President of the United States, stop what I'm doing and, try and figure out what the next move is. We know who the Iranians are, what they're about. We know who the Russians are, what they're about. North Korea, Venezuela, China. We know what all these people are about. We can create a coherent, rational foreign policy. And that's what it is that if Donald Trump wants to avoid these kinds of situations of playing tough guy, and then when he doesn't go through with the tough guy thing, making himself look kind of weak, as did President Obama, by the way. If President Obama had had a foreign policy in place, he wouldn't have had the red line in the sand problem that he had. Okay, because he wouldn't have had to react to what it is that the Syrians were doing. Okay, he would have already had some kind of a contingency plan in place. And that's just what Donald Trump needs to do. He needs to formulate a foreign policy based on the reality that the United States of America is the lone world superpower, and that we intend to exercise that power in promotion, not just defense, but promotion of our interests, military and otherwise, around the world. So, That's my little rant on that particular subject, and when we come back, I'm going to be reading from the Conservative Dictionary. Thank you very much. Welcome back. The Conservative Dictionary and Fact Book. And today's entry is called Cognitive Dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is confusion caused by the presentation of information that contradicts one's belief system or value system. Cognitive dissonance marketing is the assertion of misinformation contrary to common knowledge or belief in an attempt to A, impart a differentiating shock value to the product or service, B, present the purveyor of the misinformation as an innovative visionary, and C, confuse the customer to the extent that he is no longer sure what he believes. Cognitive dissonance marketing was tailor-made for politicians, and they have used it to great effect for years. Examples are the fly-in-the-face of history assertion that government has been responsible for all of America's progress. The perennial disclaimer, quote, I didn't say what you heard me say yesterday, unquote, and the presentation of electric cars as the wave of the future, even though the fact that it's impossible to get the energy from an electrochemical reaction that you can get from an oxidation reaction makes the idea about as sensible as a battery rifle cartridge. And that was our entry for today from the Conservative Dictionary about cognitive dissonance. And let's see. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading from The Reactionary Mind. And thank you. Welcome back. And on second thought, what I'm going to be doing instead is I want to go make mention of something that I touched on in my introduction, and that is the biggest mistake that conservative pundits make, such as Rush Limbaugh. That the biggest mistake that they make is not promoting conservatism. And at first blush, that may sound ridiculous. Well, if they say they're conservative, of course they promote conservatism, but they don't. They absolutely don't. That is the thing that bothers me the most when I listen to so-called conservative pundits on the radio, and has bothered me since 1989. The first time that I listened to Rush Limbaugh was when I came back from Germany, and I was being stationed at Kelly Air Force Base in Texas, and the guy I was supervising told me about Rush Limbaugh, said, you got to listen to this guy. And so I've been listening ever since. But there was always something about his show that bothered me. There's something in the back of my mind. I liked it. It was entertaining. It was completely different than anything I'd ever heard on the radio before. And like I said, I liked it, but there was something about it that bothered me. And it's taken me this long to finally figure out exactly what it is that bothers me the most about his show. And that is the fact that he does not promote conservatism, especially now. There's 3 parts to his show. There's pre-addiction, addiction, post-addiction. And I mean that in terms, well, never mind. Pre-addiction, addiction, and post-addiction. He became addicted to OxyContin, and while he was addicted to OxyContin, his shows were very erratic. They were very scary. That's the best way for me to describe how I felt listening to him on the radio during his addiction. Then he got into recovery, and now post-addiction, his show is different. And he claims it's better, but he's wrong. His show is better pre-addiction. Okay, because he treated the left the way they deserved to be treated. He laughed at them. He snickered at them. He treated them with the contempt that they so richly deserved. And that's part of what made his show such a success, and also gave it rhetorical viability, if you will. Now he takes them deadly seriously. and he's reactionary. And again, number one thing, what he's doing though is he is copying news broadcasters who a couple decades ago told everybody, oh, what we're going to do from now on is we will present you with the facts and we will let you decide. As a matter of fact, Fox News still says that. And so that sounds at first blush, it's a great fallacy, because a fallacy is something that at first blush sounds true, but on further investigation you find out it's false. So it sounds good and it sounds true when somebody says, hey, I'm going to give you the facts and I'm going to let you decide. Doesn't it sound empowering? Don't you feel powerful when you hear that? I'm in charge. I'm deciding. But who's really in charge? The person that has the facts. The person that's giving you the facts. Okay? If I want you to draw a socialist conclusion, all I have to do is give you only, quote, the facts, unquote, that support a socialist conclusion. And you're stuck. You will have no other choice but to draw a socialist conclusion. Okay? If I give you the facts that lead you to believe that success is only possible when, by luck, cheating, or combination of the two, then what are you going to think about rich people? What are you going to think about successful people? Are you going to admire them? Or are you going to have a tendency to look down on them? A lot of people question, why is it that we raise people up and then we tear them down? That's why. People go out and work hard to become Olympic athletes and win gold medals. And then we look for their flaws. Why? Because we have been trained to do so. The left has trained us, saying that, again, the only reason that Mr. Olympic athlete is successful is because usually, well, in the case of the Olympics especially, he's either cheated, he's gotten blood doping and whatnot, and that's why it's very, very, very important to the left that there is drug testing in the Olympics to emphasize and re-emphasize that cheating point, right? And even if they can't be caught cheating, then the left says, well, you got lucky. And the way they reinforce that is they interview the gold medalist. And they ask him, they say, do you feel lucky? And the gold medalist wants to be humble. They don't come out and say, well, no, I'm not lucky. I deserved it. Very few people want to have the humility to say, I deserved it. Because humility is really about knowing who you are. Okay? Knowing where you stand. Not overestimating and not underestimating either. That's true humility. So, they don't have the humbleness or the humility to be able to say, I deserved it. I earned it. I worked hard. Yes, I was born with certain talents. But I exploited those talents. I went out and put in 2, 3, 4, 6 hours a day in physical preparation. My diet, exercise, sleeping, getting a coach. See, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, you were lucky to be born in the United States of America. No, I wasn't. No, I'm over 18 years old. First of all, anybody says you were lucky to be born wherever you're born, they don't know. How do you know? How do you know I was lucky? How do you know what went on before I was born? Right? Metaphysically or otherwise. How do you know what went on? How do you know I didn't choose it? Were you there? No. It's a bluff. You don't know. You were lucky. No. So I can deny that. But even if we concede the point that as a child, I didn't know where I was going to be born, and so yes, I got lucky in a sense to be born in the country I was born in. When I turned 18, I got to decide for myself. Okay, I was born in the United States of America. Was I lucky? Let's pretend that I was. But when I turned 18, could I have said, you know what? Screw it. I'm gone. I'm going to Mexico. I'm going to Canada. I'm going to renounce my citizenship, and I'm going to become English, Irish, Scotch, whatever. Yes, I could have. Did I do that? No. The fact that I remained in the country, I decided to remain in this country, means I exercised good judgment. It's also not just about what it is that I was given, but what did I do with what I was given? Plenty of people inherit a fortune, and some of those people squander it. Lots of people, as a matter of fact, squander their fortunes. Very few are able to take that fortune and build on it. And those people deserve credit. They didn't get lucky. They were smart. They were disciplined. Okay? So the point is, luck matters in life, but on the margins. Luck is not the reason that we succeed. We succeed because the universe smiles on us. There's a Latin phrase on the back of the dollar bill, annuit septis, and it means, may he smile on our fortunes. And the universe does. The universe smiles on our fortunes. Success is to be expected. And we know this. We know it by the evidence of our senses. So, now, on to the book called The Reactionary Mind. And The Reactionary Mind is a book that the author's written. Basically, he's conflating reactionary with being conservative. And the theme of the book so far is that being a reactionary conservative is all about power and the fear of the conservative of sharing power with people that were powerless, with the powerless. Not only in the political realm, but at home as well. So men who are traditionally in charge, the king of the castle, at home, and there was apparently a letter exchange between John Adams, one of the founders of the United States, and his wife. And his wife said, hey, you're creating a new country in which the people are going to be running the country. The people are going to be emancipated and are going to have enjoy certain powers. She says, what about women? What about the wives? Are we going to enjoy more power in the home? And John Adams didn't particularly like that idea. And so the idea was that John Adams is basically conservative because he bristles against the idea of giving more power to his wife. He also went into the ideas that in the South, slavery was much more to the average Southern master than just an economic issue. That in other places, maybe in Haiti or whatnot, slavery was basically an economic situation. So when slavery went away, people more or less shrugged their shoulders and said, well, we'll just have to find another way to make money. But that in the South, in Georgia and Alabama, etc., that the relationship between slave and master was familial. They were, the master was naming the slaves and their children, their offspring, and was not just telling them what to do in terms of work, but was running their lives down to the lowest detail. And so it was, I described it as that getting rid of slavery would have been like removing a tattoo kind of thing. It's that, there's that kind of a relationship. And that after slavery, that there was many whites and blacks that noticed that there was a huge difference in the relationships between whites and blacks. There's a lot of distance in that relationship. So, and I've argued so far that he's wrong about his definition of conservative, that conservative and reactionary. He's also talked about traditionalists, and that conservatives, traditionalists, and reactionaries are different creatures altogether. And so that the conservative is the person that makes the presumption for the status quo, and that is recognizes the primacy of the individual, and that reactionaries are pretty much just that, people that react and have no, and that's it. That's basically all they do. And traditionalists are people with a slavish devotion to the status quo. The conservative is open-minded. The conservative says, I make the presumption for the status quo, but I'm willing to change if there's an obvious case for change. Traditionalists will refuse to change even when there's an obvious case for change. So slavery owners would not be conservatives, they would be traditionalists. So, to the book. Historically, the conservative has sought to forestall the march of democracy in both the public and the private spheres, on the assumption that advances in one necessarily spur advances in the other. Quote, in order to keep the state out of the hands of the people, unquote, wrote the French monarchist Louis de Bonald, quote, it is necessary to keep the family out of the hands of women and children, unquote. Even in the United States, this effort has periodically yielded fruit. Despite our Whiggish narrative of the steady rise of democracy, historian Alexander Keysar has demonstrated that the struggle for a vote in the United States has been as much a story of reaction and contraction as a retraction and contraction as one of progress and expansion. Quote, with class tensions and apprehensions, unquote, on the part of political and economic elites constituting, quote, the single most important obstacle to universal suffrage from the late 18th century to the 1960s, unquote. Still, a more profound and prophetic stance on the right has been Adams' cede the field of the public. If you must, stand fast in the private. Allow men and women to become democratic citizens of the state. Make sure that they remain feudal subjects in the family, the factory, and the field. The priority of conservative political argument has been the maintenance of private regimes of power, even at the cost of the strength and the integrity of the state. We see this political arithmetic at work in the ruling of a Federalist court in Massachusetts that a Loyalist woman who fled the Revolution was the adjutant of her husband and thus should not be held responsible for fleeing and should not have her property confiscated by the state. In the refusal of Southern slaveholders to yield their slaves to the Confederate cause, and the more recent insistence of the Supreme Court that women could not be legally obligated to sit on juries because they are, quote, still regarded as the center of home and family life, unquote, with their, quote, own special responsibilities, unquote. Conservatism, then, is not a commitment to limited government and liberty or a wariness of change, a belief in evolutionary reform, or a politics of virtue. These may be the byproducts of conservatism, one or more of its historically specific and ever-changing modes of expression, but they are not its animating purpose. Neither is conservatism a makeshift fusion of capitalists, Christians, and warriors, for that fusion is impelled by a more elemental force, the opposition to the liberation of men and women from the fetters of their superiors, particularly in the private sphere. Such a view might seem miles away from the libertarian defense of the free market, with its celebration of the atomistic and autonomous individual, but it is not. When the libertarian looks out upon society, he does not see isolated individuals, he sees private, often hierarchical groups, where a father governs his family and an owner his employees. No simple defense of one's own place and privilege. The conservative, as I've said, may or may not be directly involved in or benefit from the practices of the rule he defends. Many, as we'll see, are not. The conservative position stems from a genuine conviction that a world thus emancipated would be ugly, brutish, base, and dull. It will lack the excellence of a world where the better man commands the worse. When Burke adds in the letter quoted above that the great object of the revolution is, quote, to root out that thing called an aristocrat or nobleman and gentleman, unquote, he's not simply referring to the power of the nobility. He is also referring to the distinction that power brings to the world. If the power goes, the distinction goes with it. The vision of this connection between excellence and rule is what brings together in post-war America the unlikely alliance of the libertarian with his vision of the employer's untrammeled power in the workplace, the traditionalist with his vision of the father's rule at home, and the statist with his vision of a heroic leader pressing his hand upon the face of the earth. And each in his own way subscribes to this typical statement from the 19th century of the conservative creed. Quote, to obey a real superior is one of the most important of all virtues, a virtue absolutely essential to the attainment of anything great and lasting, unquote. So, he is, again, he's wrong on this because he's indicating on the one hand, he is assuming that superiors and inferiors are such, because it says here, there it goes. It will lack the excellence of a world where the better man commands the worse. But in reality, you're looking at traditionalism. The man runs the household, not necessarily because he's the best one to run the household, but simply because he's the man. Okay? And the same thing that goes with the owner. Who says that the owner of a particular business is the best person to run the business? Very often owners aren't the best person. They'll hire a general manager to run the business, and the owner just goes ahead and collects the profits and pays the taxes and whatnot, but leaves the day-to-day operations to somebody who is best equipped to do that. So, again, that's not conservative to simply assume that because somebody is in charge, they're the best one equipped to be in charge. And what we're bringing up here in a kind of a roundabout way is about meritocracy. Made the best person. He's right when he says that the better man should command the worse. The smarter person should command the slower person. Should be in charge of, govern, etc. But that's what a meritocracy is about. And traditionalism is not about meritocracy. Traditionalism is aristocratic. Okay, this is what you have in a kingdom situation. The king rules, and not because he or she is the best person in the kingdom to rule, but because he or she was born at the right time and place. Has the right bloodline. Okay, so very often you end up with people. What was it, King George VI? That was the king of England during the Revolutionary War, and supposedly had some pretty severe mental problems, neuroses or psychoses. But he was still a king. But you can't tell me with all of those problems that he was the best person to act as the chief executive for England. Okay, he's ruling because he was in the right place at the right time. So I want to make that distinction. But let's see here. What do we got for the conclusion? There it is. Who are the true conservatives? They are the people that understand that conservatism is a lifestyle. They're patriotic people who use common sense. They make judgments instead of predictions, speak clearly and definitively, and are not afraid to say no. They are open-minded, asking why rather than why not. They're consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of their existence, unafraid to learn or correct their mistakes. They are normal Americans. And that brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.